to travel for a job, 1 hour is really the limit. So if you think about sort of last mile issues, getting to the office, leaving home, the journey is likely going to be longer than just that 1 hour journey on the MARC. Other things that sort of made us interested in this issue was that the job market in Washington is really strong with relatively high salaries. So on average, DC jobs pay about $30,000 more a year than Baltimore jobs. On the sort of flip side of things, the housing market in Baltimore is a lot more affordable than DC. So DC houses sell for about 4 times more than in Baltimore, and rent is about double.
So just to next, so when everyone is in agreement, we got clearance for that. And I mentioned an email that I sent.
So we're looking at sort of an express MARC service as a possible solution to all of this. So now I'm going to hand it off to Ron.
Thanks, Mac. We're only seeing, and I'm seeing the chat, a couple of people saying the same thing. I only see like, I don't even see the slides. I kind of see the left-hand margin of the slide.
Oh, sorry about that. Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Sorry about that.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks everyone. Also, good morning. I see a few familiar names. Hey, Paul. I really appreciate the chance for us to be with you guys today. Yeah, I think Mac gave a pretty good overview of what this effort and this paper was about. So just kind of dive in. We should also note that this work kind of started before COVID. So most of the information, in fact, all the information and data really comes from that period. And then sort of right after we started, the pandemic arrived. But we were really dealing with MARC as it existed prior to, I guess, March 2020. So very, very quickly, given this premise, I think that what MARC was running then and hopefully will return to was about 30 trains a day. The majority of them make all local stops. There's a couple of expresses that cut back to just a few stations. And I should also point out, we are talking about the Penn line. We didn't look at the Camden line. Back in February 2020, the boardings were about 26,000, and that was trending upwards. And each MARC train, if you take a 6-car train, they do run some longer ones, but a 6-car train, the bi-level cars with a comfortable standing load can carry about 900 people. And until the pandemic hit, I was a MARC commuter, and I could tell you there's plenty of days where the standing load is uncomfortable, and there's a lot more people than that on the train. The running times really vary, so it was interesting to put that chart together. If you look at the locals that make all the stops between Baltimore and Union Station, Washington, they run between 60 and 65 minutes roughly. The expresses cut about 10 minutes off of that by skipping a couple of the stations that have lower ridership. But if you want to get a better sense of what's possible, you can look at Amtrak. Amtrak's regional trains are doing that run with maybe 2 stops just a stop in New Carrollton, BWI. They're doing it in 40 to 45 minutes. And the Acela, a couple of which don't make any stops, are doing it in just under 30 minutes. So you get a sense of what is possible in that corridor. Next, please, Matt. 5, 6. So we looked at how would you do this if you were going to speed up MARC with the resources, or maybe that exist today, or some additional ones. You could do it 2 ways, basically. It's not overly complicated. You could take some of the local trains and make them expresses, just run them without all the stops they currently make. Or you could add some additional into the schedule. That would be pure expresses, maybe even nonstop trains. Both of those options raise issues. Certainly converting local trains to express, you'd be eliminating service to certain stations. And that certainly has a negative impact in some areas. I talked to some of the MARC staff, and while they hadn't done at that point any recent ridership surveys, and I doubt they've done any since, anytime they change the schedule and they take out one station, they get a lot of pushback. The other issue is if you were going to add train, the fleet is fairly stretched today. They always have maintenance issues, but the fleet is aging and they have some, particularly on the locomotive side. So they're stretching to run the service they run today. If in fact they were to make a real investment in this, that there would be the expense of adding rolling stock, adding people. There certainly are some platform and storage spaces. You know, at Baltimore Penn, there's clearly an issue on where you can lay up trains, where you can where they could take their time between turning around and going back. Union Station is a similar issue. Union Station is extremely congested. It is not unusual in the morning in Union Station that the trains are so backed up. They park at the end of the platform, and you have to walk the full length of your train and the train that pulled in front of you to get up to the head house of the station. So there's some issues, you know, money of which can be solved with money. Next, please, Matt. So we took a look at just timing, making the commute. And again, this was sort of one day in time. We picked a day in January and used largely Google travel data. And we picked a kind of a we just artificially picked a place at 27th Street in North Calvert and an office in DC at Connecticut and K. If you take the driving, and in general, that drive at about 7 in the morning was taking about 83 minutes from end to end. It varies a little bit, obviously traffic varies, but in general, it was on average about 83 minutes. If you take MARC, the way MARC runs today, it is longer. You're talking about, and we assumed a bus connection to the stations, bus to Penn Station, then your MARC train, then some sort of then a metro connection on the Washington end, and that was coming out to about 99 minutes, just under 100. If we then went back and assumed the MARC train could be reduced to 30 minutes, 35 minutes instead of the hour that it's taking today, you could cut that back to about 75 minutes, which, you know, is not a huge savings, but about an 8-minute saving over driving, and certainly without some of the wear and tear. Next, please. So the question is, you know, just in general in MARC and in terms of looking at some additional service, some of which could be express, what are, you know, are there developments on the horizon? And there are some positive developments. There is a corridor improvement plan, and there are improvements happening right now between Baltimore and Washington. They have made track improvements. You know, there's a new station at BWI. So there has been some improvements, and there's more to do on that. There's clearly the possibility of infrastructure legislation and increased support for Amtrak. We know the president is an Amtrak supporter. When I used to work for Amtrak, used to see him on the train all the time. So we're hoping that maybe that will involve some additional investment in Amtrak. There clearly is a lot of optimism among the Amtrak leadership right now that they're going to see some additional money for investment coming their way. There are station improvement plans that are underway. I mean, Baltimore Penn is moving forward, which is going to be a completely new Penn Station related development. It's going to add some platform space, and that's going to make it easier, particularly if there was an increase in service. Expresses may not stop at West Baltimore, but West Baltimore is due for a major increase. Unfortunately, West Baltimore today is kind of a super bus stop. It's, you know, at best 2 doors on a train stop in the wooden platform, and there's a bus stop shelter there. There is a plan for a fairly dramatic improvement at West Baltimore, but a lot of it depends on the redevelopment, reconstruction of the B&P tunnels, and that's up in the air right now, and it's not clear when that will happen, although lately we're hearing there is some movement towards starting to make that happen. BWI could be a stop on an express service, and while there is a new station, there also is a plan to be adding platforms at BWI and track. Odenton probably wouldn't get a stop, wouldn't be served by an express service, but there is a plan for improving Odenton. New Carrollton, which might get a stop on express service, is extremely confined. It's basically one platform, two tracks for a lot of service. There is a plan to expand New Carrollton by adding platforms there. And Washington Union Station has a huge redevelopment plan. It's been in the works for a long time. It's going to be in the works for a lot longer. I just had a briefing with the developer there. They're looking at sometime over the next 10 years. So that's got a ways to go, but that would include some additional platforms that would allow for more flexibility for running more service. There's been some conversation about the BNP tunnels. They are desperately in need of repair. They're the third highest priority on Amtrak's capital list of I would call desperately needed improvements. If Amtrak were to provide more slots, more space for trains to run, maybe if the state made a contribution to that, there's been some conversation about that, the state ought to get something in return, and maybe that would be more MARC service. One of the issues with adding trains, I think that I didn't mention in that slide, is the fact is Amtrak argues the corridor is very congested today, and there's probably truth to that. And adding trains and adding slots, trains are generally assigned to slots, which is kind of a segment of track that they can use in between other trains, a pathway. And they claim they're almost maxed out at that point. You know, you can argue that several ways, particularly with improved signal systems. You can run more trains, you can run trains closer together. So maybe if there was some improvement in the BNP tunnels that the state contributed to, Amtrak could relent and allow for a couple of more slots. There would really need to be a negotiation with Amtrak to make this improvement to allow more computers. Okay, next, please. We looked at the cost of this. So if you take that theoretical trip that I laid out before that ended up at about 99 minutes today, or 75 if you had express service, you're looking at roughly about $18, almost $19 round trip each day. That's the MARC fare, assuming a monthly pass. That's the bus to Penn Station, and that's the subway and metro from Union Station to we picked Farragut North, but that pretty much that fare and metro gets you anywhere downtown. So you're looking about spending about $19 a day. If you look at driving, obviously it's a lot higher. At that point, we used 2019 federal mileage rates. I'm sure it's gone up, but just on the basic rate, which was 50 something cents a mile, it was wear and tear and gas and everything else was about $64 for that trip. Which you think about it, when people drive from Baltimore to Washington to commute, I doubt anybody is thinking they are spending $64 to make that trip. And then if you look at parking, you're looking at $12 a day. And I saw someone just added on the chat, yeah, that the MARC, that MTA, you can get on the MTA bus with your MARC pass. That's true. I actually forgot that, but you can. So that would reduce the cost of taking MARC a little more. $12 a day in Washington for parking is cheap. That's roughly a monthly parking permit of about $250 a month in an office building. And frankly, at least pre-COVID, in general, that was on the low end of what a monthly sticker would cost. Next, please. So Mac will get into some of the issues related to the housing in Baltimore and how all this relates. I think from a transit standpoint, and you know, as the issues we looked into, I mean, there's a couple of things. There clearly is an issue about the relative importance of commute times in making a housing decision. I looked at a lot of literature, and frankly, to some extent, it's all over the map. There are some authors and researchers who have argued that commute times is very high on the list of what you consider when you make a housing decision. There are others that say it is further down on the list, especially when you're considering the location of your housing, you're considering the type of housing, the amenities it offers, the school systems, all that sort of thing. And for some higher levels of amenities, people are willing to make a much longer commute, and I think we know that to be true. There is an issue of the image and the unknowns of Baltimore to DC workers. I've spent good bit of my life working in Baltimore and a good bit of it working in DC. And I was always amazed when I worked at, especially at the MTA, how many people I talked to had never been to DC who lived in Baltimore, who were natives of Baltimore. And I was always amazed when I work in DC, how little people who live and work in DC know about Baltimore. I'm always a big booster and telling them all these things. And I was amazed how people were really, I didn't know that kind of stuff. I mean, clearly there needs to be some investment in MARC, and there needs to be consideration of future investment scenarios for MARC. MARC, in my view, relatively is a cheap investment for a very, very major benefit. It's one of the few statewide systems we have that it connects two large metropolitan areas. And I think that an investment in MARC could go a long way. They're clearly, even today, or at least again, pre-COVID, the ridership was growing. It was, many of the rush hour trains are packed. There clearly is interested in, and that is the way it was running, which is slow and parking difficulties and all sorts of issues, but it still attracts a lot of people. Another issue, which Matt could talk a little bit about, which is what's the attractiveness of the Baltimore housing stock to someone living in DC. Can't help but avoid gentrification. Is this going to aggravate gentrification that's already occurring in Baltimore? Are there ways to deal with that? There's also, to try to make your trip faster. I mean, clearly, unless you live within proximity of Baltimore Penn Station, maybe West Baltimore, and your job is within proximity of Washington Union Station, the commute just gets longer and longer. Trying a fast train is going to be less and less important to you if you live in East Baltimore, far out in East Baltimore, if you live in Towson, and consequently, if you work in Washington and you work in Foggy Bottom or further parts of downtown that are not close to Union Station. So that's certainly going to make the train, fast train, less of an issue and less of a decider. Finally, everybody's kind of grappling right now with what's public transportation going to look like post-COVID. All of the transit agencies are looking, are people going to come back? How long is it going to take? What needs to change to get people back? And I'll turn it over to Mac.
Thanks. So as I mentioned up front, there's sort of a couple issues that we imagine this express MARC could potentially solve. One of them is sort of both a housing unaffordability issue in DC and a sort of persistent problem of vacant housing in Baltimore. So again, as I mentioned up front, the typical home value in DC is about 4 times that of Baltimore. Rent in DC is about double. So when we think about, taking in the cost of commuting every single day and the savings of rent, not even looking at differences in salary, this still makes a whole lot of sense. Going back to 2018, the vacancy rate is pretty different for both homes for sale and for rentals in the two markets. So there's, again, just a lot more opportunity in Baltimore for the housing market compared to DC. It's as folks here, I'm sure, well aware, it's exploded in the past decade. Then looking at this issue of vacant housing in Baltimore and thinking about where we have MARC stations in the city, this is just the red circle is a half-mile radius going out from the West Baltimore MARC station, and there are about, and this is data from 2020, there were about 1,000 of Baltimore's 16,000 vacant homes were within a mile. And then that sort of green highlighted area is both the end of the highway to nowhere and the surface level parking lot. And that just sort of highlights, again, the development opportunity that exists around that station. So again, Ron mentioned some of this, but I think there's a real opportunity here that I think there's been some discussion of already in Baltimore about, for years we've been talking about how do we repurpose the highway to nowhere, but it's an expensive endeavor to cover it up or fill it in, turn it into a public park. But our new Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, has highlighted this as an issue that he wants to take on. So there's huge potential if Baltimore can get out ahead of this. And then again, the Biden team is preparing this $3 trillion infrastructure stimulus package, which I've seen that we should see in the coming weeks. And there's going to be a significant portion of that will go to transit. Who knows what's going to be in there, but again, opportunity. And then looking at sort of the city's 2017 zoning code rewrite, allowing for more transit-oriented developments. The sort of all of these factors go into make this sort of more possible than it could have been in normal times. Looking at this issue of gentrification, so if this idea was successful, if we were able to implement it, obviously there's a concern that especially around the West Baltimore MARC station, where current housing values are very low. If there was suddenly a large induced demand, that could spur displacement of residents. So there are a variety of models that could be followed to protect against displacement. One of which could be a REIT or a real estate investment trust, where either city-owned vacant land and buildings could sort of be used to benefit existing residents, or they could allow for equity investing in a REIT sort of around that station. You could look to inclusionary zoning and requirements for affordable housing and developments, but from what I've seen in Baltimore, that hasn't really produced a whole lot of affordable housing. So I think there's some dangers in doing that. There are other models like community land trusts that are gaining popularity and now, as of this week, I think have some real funding behind them. But then there are, sort of existing tax credit programs like the state renters and homeowners tax credit program and the homestead tax credit that can sort of soften the blow of gentrification. So, the city or neighborhood groups could do targeted outreach, sort of door knocking, to make sure that existing renters and homeowners are signed up for this. Again, looking at the highway to nowhere, the city could possibly look at leasing out that land and for development opportunities and using the income again to try to prevent displacement. Then looking at, again, occupations and wage premiums in the capital. So this, the little train there is Union Station, and there is a 1 mile and 2 mile radius around there. And so this is a map of jobs by census tract for commuters from Baltimore to DC, and it's the shaded areas are where current commuters work. So this is data from 2017, so it's pretty old, but back then there were about 3,000 people that lived in Baltimore and commuted to DC for primary jobs and an additional 300 for secondary jobs. We have no idea how many of those took the train versus drove, but you can see that a significant number of those jobs are within Union Station. If we looked at the 2 mile radius from Union Station as sort of the possible expansion of the job market in Baltimore, this would add 300,000 jobs to Baltimore City's job market, and that's about the number of jobs that are available in Baltimore City alone. So this would represent a doubling of the city's sort of job market potential. Obviously, people work in the county and suburbs, but if we just compared Baltimore City to this 2 mile ring around the Union Station, there's quite a bit of possibility. Then, looking at wage premiums, so on average, DC jobs pay about $30,000 more than jobs in DC, but there are certain advantages for certain industries, and I've highlighted a couple of these where the differences are particularly striking, both in the number of jobs, but also in the pay differential. So, what you see across the board generally is that industries that require a higher level of education, there's more of a premium there between Baltimore and DC. But even in the accommodation and food services industry, there is this $10,000 wage premium, and that's pretty significant even after taking into account the cost of commuting. And again, there are almost 50,000 more jobs there. Looking beyond just sort of working in DC, there's obviously a significant number of consulting firms that work in Baltimore and work for federal government agencies. So, an express mark would certainly benefit them. And again, it's not just jobs that require a high level of education. There are specific service occupations such as security guards and bartenders that we looked at, where the occupational wage premium was high enough to make the commute worthwhile. And, a lot of those jobs that tend to be lower wage, people are already commuting significant distances to get to them due to issues of spatial mismatch and the location of housing and job centers. So again, as Ron mentioned, there's a significant amount of uncertainty in post-COVID, but I think there's also a lot of potential in the new work from home. So right when work from home came out, there were two economists, Dingle and Nyman, who put out a study looking at the potential for work from home. And so in 2018, about 25% of employees work from home at least some amount. I don't know if it was during a week or during a month, but their research showed that about 37% of all jobs can be performed entirely from home. Now, obviously, not everybody wants to do that. The average employee wants to work from home about 2 days a week. And so this makes a longer commute more feasible. So I know I have plenty of friends that have tried to live in Baltimore full time and work in DC. And they just couldn't do the daily commute. Some people can, a lot of people can't. But if you're only commuting into DC 2 days a week for your meetings and then working from home the remainder of the week, that becomes potentially a lot more attractive. Going forward, what are our known unknowns? Who is the marginal Baltimore commuter? So if there was this express train, who does this become attractive to? Looking at the side from DC, if there was an express train, does this, do people start to reconsider continuing to work in DC, but living in Baltimore and saving on housing costs? It's again, as Ron alluded to, it's hard to know sort of the level of knowledge of DC residents, but it seems to be fairly low. So there's opportunity there again, where there could be a targeted outreach campaign to raise awareness about this potential that the city could do. Then again, looking at return to post-COVID, economist Nicholas Bloom did a survey about in a post-COVID world, what were people's hesitancy to return to activity. And 72% of people said that they would still be wary of doing activities like riding the subway that would have them packed in close confines with other people. And 12% said that they were absolutely not returning to any pre-COVID activity. So, they would continue to wear masks and social distance. So that might change going forward as people become more comfortable with vaccines, but still, I think there's going to be a significant amount of hesitancy. Then again, looking sort of at the opinion of local governments, the Boston University puts out a annual survey to mayors, and about 40% of mayors said that they didn't expect a return to normal for mass transit until after 2021, and they expected sort of a long-term decline in transit use. Then again, sort of at the state level, there is, again, uncertainty about long-term transit budgets in terms of maintenance and investments. And yeah, well, we can open it up for questions.
So before we open the floor, on behalf of Transit Choices, we would sincerely like to thank you both for sharing your time this morning. We appreciate your interesting and informative presentation and look forward to staying in touch with respect to follow-up. So thank you very much.
Thanks.